I stood alone in my small kitchen in Queen Anne, holding the edge of the counter as if it were the only thing keeping me upright. Outside, the morning rain tapped softly against the window, the kind of gentle sound that once felt comforting, but now only made the silence heavier. The kettle had already boiled, forgotten, its whistle long gone, just like the warmth that used to fill this house. At 70 years old, mornings had become slower, quieter, and far more reflective than I ever imagined they would be. This was the same kitchen where I once packed school lunches, wiped sticky fingers, and listened to my children argue about who would sit where at the table. Now it was just me, and memories that refused to stay quiet. That morning my phone buzzed on the counter. I didn't rush to answer it. Experience had taught me that most calls these days were not to ask how I was doing, but to ask what I could still give. When I finally looked at the screen, my heart sank slightly. It was my son. For a brief moment, hope flickered, the foolish kind that mothers never seem to outgrow. I wondered if he was calling to check on me, or maybe just to hear my voice. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and answered softly. His voice was rushed, distracted. No greeting, no warmth, just words that felt rehearsed. He talked about plans, responsibilities, stress, all things I understood well, because I had once carried the weight of an entire household without complaint. Then came the pause. That uncomfortable silence before someone asks for something they already assume you will agree to. He mentioned staying with me, for a while. Not asked. Assumed. When I didn't respond immediately, he added, almost casually, that it would be easier for everyone if I just adjusted like I always had. I looked around my kitchen, my safe place, my last space that still felt like mine, and realized how small my life had become in their eyes. To them, I wasn't a mother who had sacrificed decades of her life. I wasn't a woman who had dreams once. I was convenience, a solution, a quiet corner where their problems could be stored without guilt. As he kept talking, my mind drifted back to the years when I put everyone else first without hesitation. I remembered nights spent awake beside sick beds, years of saving every extra dollar so my children could have more than I ever did, and holidays where I smiled through exhaustion because their happiness mattered more than my rest. I never kept score. I never expected repayment. But standing there, phone pressed to my ear, I felt something crack deep inside me. A realization that maybe love, when taken for granted long enough, turns invisible. When the call ended, the kitchen felt colder. I sat down slowly at the table, my joints aching, my chest heavier than my body could explain. I wasn't angry. Anger requires energy. What I felt was something quieter and far more painful, the slow understanding that in my old age I had become optional. And in that silence, with the rain still falling outside, I sensed that something in my life was about to change, whether my family was ready for it or not. That afternoon stretched longer than it should have, the hours moving slowly as if time itself sensed the weight pressing down on my chest. I moved through the house doing small familiar tasks, folding laundry that didn't need folding, wiping already clean counters, straightening picture frames that hadn't shifted in years. Anything to keep my hands busy and my thoughts at bay. Every room held echoes of a life that once revolved around purpose. The hallway still carried faint pencil marks from when I measured my children's height against the wall, promising myself I would never paint over them. The living room couch sagged slightly in the middle, shaped by decades of bedtime stories, scraped knees soothed with kisses, and quiet nights when I stayed awake waiting for my son to come home safely. I had built this life piece by piece, sacrifice by sacrifice, never imagining that one day I would walk through it feeling like a guest in my own story. By evening my phone rang again. This time it wasn't my son, it was my daughter-in-law. Her voice was polite, almost sweet, the kind of tone people use when they want to sound reasonable while asking for something unreasonable. She spoke about how difficult things had become, how overwhelmed they were, how expensive everything was now. I listened quietly, nodding even though she couldn't see me, because that was what I had always done. Then she said it plainly without hesitation. They needed me to move some of my things, make space, be flexible. Flexible. The word landed hard. I had been flexible my entire life. Flexible with my dreams, my body, my time, my silence. When I didn't answer right away, she added that it was only temporary, though her voice lacked conviction, as if even she didn't believe that lie anymore. After the call ended, I sat alone at the dining table long after the sun disappeared. The house grew darker, shadows stretching across the floor like quiet witnesses. I realized then that no one had asked me what I wanted. Not once. No one wondered if I was tired or lonely, or afraid of what it meant to grow old in a world that no longer slowed down for people like me. I thought about all the times I had said yes when my body screamed no, all the moments I swallowed my needs to keep the peace, all the apologies I made even when I had done nothing wrong. Somewhere along the way, my kindness had been mistaken for obligation. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, sleep refused to come. Instead, memories flooded in sharp and vivid. I saw myself younger, standing in this same room, rocking a crying baby while bills piled up on the dresser. I remembered promising myself that my children would never feel unwanted or burdensome. And yet, here I was feeling exactly that. The realization didn't come with anger or tears at first, but with a strange clarity. For the first time in decades, a quiet question formed in my mind, one I had never allowed myself to ask before. What happens if I stop saying yes? The thought scared me, but beneath the fear there was something else. A small, unfamiliar sense of strength beginning to stir. As if the woman I once was hadn't disappeared after all, she had just been waiting. The next morning arrived without any sense of peace. Dawn crept through the thin curtains, casting a pale gray light across the bedroom, and I realized I hadn't truly slept at all. My body felt heavy, as if every year of my life had settled into my bones overnight. I lay there listening to the house wake up, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a bus passing outside, the familiar creak of the floorboards as the temperature shifted. This house had always spoken to me in small ways, comforting ways. But that morning it felt different. It felt like it was asking me something, quietly but insistently. How much longer will you pretend everything is fine? I forced myself out of bed and shuffled into the kitchen. Making tea had once been a ritual I enjoyed. A moment of calm before the day began. That morning, even that felt mechanical. As the kettle boiled, my thoughts returned to the phone call from the night before. Be flexible. The words echoed again and again. Flexible meant shrinking myself. Flexible meant accepting discomfort so others could live comfortably. Flexible meant erasing the fact that I was still a person, not just a role model, grandmother, background figure in someone else's busy life. I carried my tea to the small table by the window and sat down, watching neighbors begin their routines. A young mother hurried past with a stroller, coffee in one hand, phone pressed to her ear. An elderly man walked his dog slowly, carefully, as if each step required permission from his body. Watching them, I felt an unexpected wave of sadness, not just for myself, but for how easily people like me became invisible. You live long enough, give enough, and somehow the world assumes you no longer need anything in return. Around mid-morning, my son finally called. His name lit up my phone screen, and for a brief moment, hope flickered inside me. Maybe he would ask how I was. Maybe he would apologize. Maybe I had misunderstood everything. I answered quickly, my voice softer than I intended. He didn't waste time on greetings. He spoke in that strained, impatient tone I had heard more often in recent years, explaining logistics, finances, stress. He said they were doing their best. He said I should understand. And then, as if discussing an item that no longer fit in a crowded room, he said it might be better if I stayed elsewhere for a while, just until things settled. I felt something crack open inside me then. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a quiet break, like ice giving way under careful feet. I asked him where he expected me to go. There was a pause on the line. He hadn't thought that far ahead. He mentioned possibilities, a friend, a smaller place, something affordable. Each suggestion felt like another step away from the life I had built. Another reminder that my place in his world had grown smaller without my permission. After the call ended, I sat there holding the phone long after the screen went dark. I wasn't crying. That surprised me. Instead, I felt hollow, like something essential had been scooped out and replaced with cold air. I walked through the house again, but this time my eyes lingered on everything differently. The framed photos on the wall showed smiling faces, birthdays, graduations, holidays. I remembered the sacrifices behind each picture. The extra shifts I worked, the meals I skipped, the dreams I postponed. None of that was visible in the photographs. All anyone saw was a mother who had done her job. In the afternoon, I went up to the attic, a place I hadn't visited in years. Dust hung thick in the air, and the smell of old cardboard and memories wrapped around me. I opened boxes filled with forgotten pieces of myself. Old letters, recipe cards written in my mother's handwriting. A faded dress I once wore to an important interview I never got because childcare fell through. As I sat on the floor sorting through those remnants, something shifted inside me. This wasn't just about a house or inconvenience. It was about being erased slowly, politely, with smiles and reasonable explanations. I found an old journal buried beneath a stack of blankets. I didn't remember writing most of it, but as I flipped through the pages, my own words stared back at me. Hopes, fears, promises I had made to myself decades ago. One line stopped me cold. Don't let them forget that you matter too. My hands trembled as I traced the sentence with my finger. Somewhere along the way I had forgotten that myself. That evening, when the house grew quiet again, I made a decision. Not a loud one, not a dramatic declaration, but a firm one. I wasn't going to disappear quietly. I wasn't going to be shuffled aside like old furniture. I didn't yet know what standing up for myself would look like, and the fear was still there, heavy and real. But beneath that fear was something stronger now, resolve. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I realized that the story of my life wasn't over, no matter how much others might wish to simplify it. This wasn't the end of my usefulness or my relevance. It was the beginning of a reckoning, one that would force uncomfortable truths into the open. And whether my family was ready or not, things were about to change. The decision I made that night didn't bring me peace right away. Instead, it brought restlessness. I slept lightly, waking often, my mind racing with questions I had avoided for years. What did standing up for myself actually mean? How does a woman my age redraw boundaries when everyone around her is used to her silence? When morning came, I felt both exhausted and strangely alert, like someone standing on the edge of unfamiliar ground. I moved slowly through my routine, but something had shifted inside me. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was observing, paying attention to how often my needs had been quietly dismissed and how easily I had allowed it. Later that day, my son came by the house. He didn't call first. He rarely did anymore. I heard his car pull up and felt my heart tighten, but I didn't rush to greet him. I stayed seated at the kitchen table, hands folded, breathing steadily. When he walked in, his expression was tense, already defensive, as if he expected resistance and resented me for it before I even spoke. He started talking immediately, filling the room with explanations, justifications, complaints about stress and responsibility. I listened, truly listened, and for the first time I noticed something clearly. He wasn't cruel, but he was careless with my feelings, careless with my place in his life, careless because he had never been forced to consider the cost of his expectations. When there was finally a pause, I spoke. My voice was calm, but it surprised both of us. I told him I felt pushed aside. I told him I felt like my home was no longer mine. I told him that being a mother didn't mean I stopped being a person. He looked at me with confusion first, then frustration. He said I was overreacting. He said I was making things difficult. He said families make sacrifices. The familiar words hung in the air, words I had used myself for decades. But this time they didn't settle into me the same way. I asked him a simple question, one that stopped him cold. I asked him when was the last time he had asked me how I was doing without needing something in return. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The silence stretched between us, uncomfortable and revealing. I realized then that this wasn't about winning an argument. It was about forcing a moment of truth, even if it hurt. After he left, I felt shaky but also lighter. Speaking up hadn't fixed everything, but it had cracked the surface of something long buried. I went for a walk that afternoon, something I hadn't done in weeks. The neighborhood looked the same, but I didn't. Each step felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself. I thought about how easily women like me are expected to fade into the background, to be grateful for scraps of attention, to accept discomfort as the price of love. And I wondered how many other mothers were sitting quietly in kitchens just like mine, convincing themselves that silence was strength. That evening, I sat down and wrote a list, not of complaints but of truths. What I needed, what I was no longer willing to accept, what I still hoped for even if it scared me. Writing it down felt like drawing a line when I should have drawn years ago. I didn't know how my family would respond, or whether they would change at all. But for the first time in a long while, I knew this much with certainty. I was done disappearing. And whatever came next, it would be faced with my eyes open, my voice steady, and my dignity intact. The days that followed felt heavier, not because I regretted speaking up, but because truth has a way of unsettling everything it touches. My son didn't call. That silence spoke louder than any argument we'd had before. I moved through the house with a new awareness, noticing how quiet it really was, how much of my life had been built around waiting, for footsteps, for phone calls, for acknowledgement. Without that waiting, there was an emptiness but also space. Space I didn't yet know how to fill, but space all the same. A few days later, my daughter-in-law came by. She stood in the doorway, arms folded, her smile tight and polite. She talked about misunderstanding, about stress, about how hard things were for everyone. I listened, but this time I didn't rush to reassure her. When she suggested again that I adjust for the sake of peace, I gently told her that peace built on one person's silence wasn't peace at all. The words surprised me as they left my mouth. They were simple, but they were mine. Her expression changed. Not angry, just unsettled. I realized then how unfamiliar it was for them to hear me speak this way. That night, alone again, doubt crept in. Had I gone too far? Was I being selfish? Old habits don't disappear quietly, and years of conditioning whispered that a good mother endures, that love means sacrifice without limits. I sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, wrestling with guilt that felt older than I was. But alongside it was another feeling, steadier, quieter, reminding me that love without respect slowly becomes resentment, and resentment poisons everyone involved. The next morning, I made a choice that scared me. I called a lawyer, not to threaten, not to punish, but to understand my options. Knowledge, I realized, was another form of strength. As I listened, taking notes with trembling hands, I felt both fear and relief. For the first time, I wasn't guessing or hoping others would do the right thing. I was preparing myself for whatever came next. That afternoon, I packed a small bag, not to leave forever, but to remind myself that I could. Each item I folded felt symbolic. I wasn't running away. I was claiming agency. I placed the bag by the door and let it sit there, a quiet promise to myself that I would no longer stay out of fear alone. When my son finally called that evening, his voice was different, less certain. He asked where I was. I told him calmly that I was still home, but that things needed to change. There was a pause, then a sigh. We didn't resolve anything that night. But for the first time, the conversation wasn't one-sided. It ended without shouting, without accusations, just uncertainty hanging between us. As I lay in bed later, staring into the dark, I understood that standing up for myself hadn't solved my problems. It had complicated them. But complications meant movement, and movement meant life. I didn't know how this story would end, but I knew this. I was no longer willing to be invisible. And whatever came next would be shaped not just by my family's choices, but by my own. The tension in the house became almost physical, like a thick fog that followed me from room to room, settling into corners and lingering long after conversations ended. My son started coming by more often, but our interactions were cautious, measured, as if we were both afraid that one wrong word would shatter whatever fragile balance remained. He spoke less about plans and more about logistics, avoiding the deeper issues that hovered between us. I noticed how he looked at me now, not with anger, but with uncertainty, as though he were seeing me for the first time as someone separate from the role he had assigned me. One afternoon, as we sat across from each other at the kitchen table, he finally asked why I was changing. The question caught me off guard. I had expected resistance, accusations, even dismissal, but not curiosity. I told him the truth. I told him that growing older had taught me how precious time really was, how exhausting it had become to live quietly for the comfort of others. I told him that I was tired of being treated as an afterthought in my own life. My voice wavered, but I didn't stop. This wasn't a speech meant to convince him. It was a confession meant to free me. He listened in silence, his hands wrapped around a mug that had long since gone cold. When he spoke, his words were slow, uncertain. He said he hadn't realized how deeply his expectations had cut. He admitted that it was easier to assume I would always adjust than to confront the discomfort of change. Hearing that didn't erase the pain, but it shifted something. Accountability, even imperfect, felt like the first crack in a wall that had been standing for years. That evening after he left, I sat alone and let myself feel everything I had been holding back: sadness, anger, grief for the years I had given without question. But beneath it all was a growing sense of peace. I had spoken my truth, and no one had taken it away from me. I realized then that dignity isn't something others grant you. It's something you claim, often quietly, often at great personal cost. Over the next few days, small changes began to appear. My son asked before making decisions. My daughter-in-law spoke more carefully, less dismissively. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was awareness. And awareness was a beginning. I knew better than to expect a complete transformation overnight. People don't unlearn habits built over decades in a matter of days. Still, the shift mattered. One morning, as sunlight filled the kitchen, I looked around and felt something unexpected: gratitude. Not because everything was fixed, but because I had finally chosen myself. I understood now that motherhood didn't require self-erasure, and love didn't demand silence. Whatever happened next, whether relationships healed fully or fractured further, I knew I would face it standing upright, rooted in the quiet strength I had rediscovered. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like something closing in on me. It felt open, uncertain, and alive. And that, more than anything, told me I had done the right thing. As weeks passed, the changes that had begun quietly started to take clearer shape. They weren't dramatic or cinematic, but they were real. And for someone like me, real change mattered more than grand gestures. My son no longer entered the house as if it belonged to him by default. He knocked. Sometimes awkwardly, sometimes almost sheepishly, but he knocked. That small act carried more respect than 1,000 apologies ever could. It told me that something inside him had shifted, even if he didn't yet have the words to explain it. One afternoon we sat together in the living room, the same room where I once read him bedtime stories and helped him with homework. The silence between us felt different now, not hostile but reflective. He told me he had been thinking a lot about his father, about the years when I carried the family on my shoulders without complaint. He admitted that watching me stand up for myself had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about entitlement and assumption. Hearing that didn't erase the past, but it softened it. Healing, I realized, isn't about forgetting what hurt you. It's about being seen after the hurt has been acknowledged. My daughter-in-law changed too, though more slowly. Her kindness no longer felt performative. She asked before rearranging things, before making plans that involved me. One evening she even asked how I was feeling. Truly asked, not out of obligation but with genuine curiosity. I answered honestly. Not harshly, not defensively, just honestly. That was new territory for all of us. Despite these improvements, I knew better than to mistake progress for permanence. I had lived long enough to understand that people revert when things become comfortable again. So I continued doing the work quietly, maintaining boundaries, expressing my needs, choosing when to help and when to rest. I enrolled in a local art class, something I had always postponed. Sitting among strangers, paintbrush in hand, I felt a part of myself awaken that had been dormant for years. I wasn't just someone's mother anymore. I was a woman rediscovering her voice, her interests, her worth. One evening while cleaning out a drawer, I found an old note my son had written as a child. "I love you, Mom. Thank you for everything." I held it for a long time, tears blurring the ink. Love had never disappeared between us. It had just been buried under expectation and silence. And now slowly we were uncovering it again, carefully, honestly. I didn't know what the future would hold. Relationships are fragile things, especially when reshaped late in life. But as I stood in my kitchen that night, the same kitchen where this journey had begun, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: steadiness. Not because everything was perfect, but because I was no longer afraid to take up space. And whatever came next, I knew I would meet it as myself, whole, visible, and finally at peace. Time has a way of revealing what truly lasts. Months passed and life settled into a new rhythm. One built not on obligation, but on mutual respect. The house felt different now. Lighter. It wasn't that the past had vanished or that wounds had magically healed, but there was space to breathe again. Space for conversations that weren't rushed, for silences that didn't feel heavy, for presence without expectation. I had learned that peace isn't loud or dramatic. It arrives quietly when you stop betraying yourself. One afternoon, as I sat by the window watching the rain fall gently onto the street below, I thought about how close I had come to disappearing into the background of my own life. How easy it would have been to say yes one more time, to swallow my discomfort, to let resentment harden into something unrecognizable. Instead, I had chosen a harder path, one that demanded honesty, courage, and the willingness to risk disapproval. And in doing so, I had given my family something unexpected, a chance to see me clearly. My son came by that evening not because he needed something, but because he wanted to share a meal. We cooked together, moving carefully around each other at first, then more comfortably, laughter finding its way back into the room. He thanked me, not just for dinner, but for teaching him something he hadn't realized he needed to learn. That love doesn't mean control. That respect doesn't come automatically with time. That even mothers have limits. Later that night, alone again, I stood in the doorway of my kitchen and looked around with new eyes. This place still held memories, some painful, some tender, but it also held possibility. I understood now that aging didn't mean fading away. It meant choosing what mattered most and letting the rest fall quietly behind you. I didn't know how many years I had left, but I knew how I wanted to live them. With honesty, with dignity, and without shrinking myself to fit someone else's comfort. If there is one truth this journey taught me, it is this. It is never too late to reclaim your voice. Never too late to draw boundaries. Never too late to remind the world, and yourself, that your life still holds meaning. I was still a mother, still a grandmother, but I was also something else entirely. A woman who finally chose herself. And in that choice, I found a peace deeper than silence could ever offer.